My hands were still trembling when I walked into the CO Group building that Monday morning. Not from cold. Chicago in October carried a particular kind of bite, the wind cutting through every layer I wore. But from something deeper, something lodged between my ribs like a splinter I couldn't reach. I had spent the entire weekend rehearsing what I would say, how I would hold my posture, how I would breathe through the meetings and the phone calls and the endless stream of responsibilities that came with being chief assistant to a man whose name alone made room temperatures drop by several degrees. I told myself I was ready. I was not ready. The elevator doors opened to the 42nd floor, and the familiar scent of cedar and cold air hit me immediately. The scent of this place, of controlled perfection. Everything here was deliberate. The pale marble floors, unmarked. The walls a muted charcoal that swallowed excess light. The staff moved in quiet, purposeful patterns, each person occupying exactly the space they were meant to occupy and no more. 3 months working here had taught me that lesson early. You did not take up unnecessary room in the world of Jim and Seo. I adjusted the strap of my bag against my shoulder and moved toward my desk, which sat like a small island outside the double doors of his private office. My chair, my monitor, my color-coded binders. The one place in this building that felt remotely mine. Except I had not been here in 9 days. 9 days of medical leave that I had requested through human resources, keeping the reason clinical and vague. Fatigue, a follow-up procedure, recovery time needed. Nobody had questioned it. Nobody ever questioned paperwork filed correctly. That was another thing this world had taught me. I set my bag down and pulled out my chair. "You're back." The voice belonged to Soo-yeon, one of the junior coordinators, a small woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory. She was standing 3 feet away with a tablet pressed to her chest, watching me with an expression I could not fully read. "I'm back," I confirmed, settling into my seat with what I hoped looked like ease. "Mr. SEO asked about your return date twice last week." She said it carefully, the way people here said most things, with precision, leaving you to determine the weight of the information yourself. My fingers stilled on the keyboard. "I'll brief him this morning." She nodded once and moved away, and I let out a slow breath through my nose. Jim and Seo had asked about my return date. Twice. I should not have found that significant. He depended on my work. The scheduling, the international correspondence in 3 languages, the document preparation, the coordination between his legal team, and the 12 other moving parts of what the outside world understood to be a real estate investment firm. The SEO group employed over 200 people across 5 cities. Of course he would notice when his chief assistant disappeared for 9 days without a thorough explanation. That was all it meant. Operational efficiency. Nothing more. I repeated that to myself as I opened the morning briefing file and began reading. The problem with repetition, I had learned, was that it rarely convinced the heart of anything. I had come to work for Jim and Seo 11 months ago, referred by a colleague who knew the SEO group was hiring and knew I was fluent in Korean, English, and Mandarin, a combination that was difficult to find and apparently worth a salary that made my previous employer look like a convenience store. I had interviewed with the head of human resources, then with the chief of operations, a quiet man named Director Kwan, who seemed to measure everything about me in that single 40-minute conversation. I did not meet Jimin until my 3rd day. I had been at my desk when the elevator opened, and something in the air shifted. Not dramatically, not like a storm, but like the moment before one, when every leaf goes still. I noticed the 2 men in dark suits first, the way they moved to either side of the corridor without instruction. Then I noticed him. He was younger than I had expected. The photographs in the company profile showed a composed man in formal settings, but photographs compressed people into flatness. In person, Jim and Seo occupied space differently. Not loudly, not with any visible effort, but with a kind of gravity that made you aware of every inch between yourself and him. He was tall, with dark hair swept back from a face that belonged in an entirely different context than a corporate hallway. His jaw was sharp, his eyes were darker than his hair, and moved across the room with a slowness that was somehow more unsettling than urgency would have been. And the tattoos. The ink climbed from beneath his collar and curled along his neck. Dark, intricate patterns that the white dress shirt tried and failed to conceal. Against the precision of his black suit, they read like a contradiction. A warning stitched into the surface of something deliberately elegant. He had glanced at me exactly once on that third day. Not a long look, not a searching one. A brief assessment, the way you might check a clock. Then he had continued into his office, and Director Kwan had appeared to tell me that Mr. Seo had reviewed my first 2 days of work and found it satisfactory. Satisfactory. I had built my professional existence around that word for months. Satisfactory reports. Satisfactory briefings. Satisfactory performance. I was the woman outside the double doors who made his world run smoothly, who anticipated what was needed before it was requested, who learned the invisible rhythms of his schedule and moved accordingly. I was efficient. I was invisible when invisibility served him better. I was present when presence was required. And then, 7 months into the role, something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It happened in fragments. A longer glance after I translated a tense negotiation call with a Shanghai contact, holding my composure while he held his. A brief pause at my desk one evening when the floor had emptied, during which he stood close enough that I could smell the cedar of his coat, and asked, quietly, in Korean, whether I had eaten. I had said yes, which was a lie, and he had said nothing in response, only looked at me for a moment before returning to his office. 40 minutes later, Director Kwan appeared with food from a restaurant 3 blocks away. These things accumulated. I filed them under professional courtesy and kept working. I was good at that, at filing things away neatly, at keeping the drawers closed. Now, on this Monday morning, with 9 days of absence behind me, and a truth I had not told anyone in this building, I stared at the morning briefing and tried to remember how to be the person who was only satisfactory, only efficient, only invisible. The double doors opened at precisely 8:47. I did not look up immediately. I had trained myself out of that reflex long ago. Looking up the moment he entered read as anticipation, and anticipation implied things I could not afford to imply. But I felt it. The way you feel a change in pressure before weather moves in. Miss Aria. His voice was low and even. It always was. In 11 months, I had never heard Jimin Seo raise his voice. The quieter he became, the more attention the room paid him. I had watched grown men go rigid at a sentence spoken barely above a murmur. I lifted my eyes. He was standing at the threshold of his office, one hand resting at his side, watching me with that same unhurried assessment I had catalogued so many times. Behind him, I could see Director Kwan and 2 others already positioned near the far wall. A morning briefing was scheduled for 9. "Good morning, Mr. Seo," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Something crossed his expression, too fast to name, too deliberate to be accidental. "My office, 5 minutes before the briefing." He turned and went back through the doors. I stared at my screen for exactly 4 of those 5 minutes, willing my pulse to behave. Inside, in the pale gray room with the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Chicago's skyline, I placed his morning documents on the conference table and began arranging them the way he preferred. Agenda first, correspondence second, flagged items in the top right corner. I was reaching across the table to align the last folder when I felt him close behind me, not touching. Just present, the way gravity is present, invisible but undeniable. "You were gone 9 days," he said quietly. "Yes. I apologize for any disruption to." I didn't say it was a disruption. I straightened and turned, and he was closer than I had calculated, close enough that I had to consciously hold my ground instead of stepping back. His eyes moved across my face, with a deliberateness that felt like being read rather than seen. "Are you well?" he asked. It was such a simple question. 4 words. And it was the question. Of all the questions he could have chosen. In a room where everything was strategy and nothing was accidental, that my body chose to betray me. My hand moved before I could stop it, instinctively, the way the body remembers things the mind is still trying to forget. I pressed my palm flat against my stomach. A reflex. 1 second. Then I pulled my hand back and looked at the table. But he had seen it. The silence that followed lasted only 3 or 4 heartbeats, but it had a different texture than every silence before it. Heavier, charged with something that had no name yet, and would have enormous consequences the moment it acquired one. When I finally made myself look at him, Jimincio was very still, and he was staring at me with eyes that were no longer assessing. They were calculating. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my apartment with the ceiling above me, and the city humming its indifferent noise through the walls, and I thought about that silence. 3 or 4 heartbeats. The way his eyes had changed. Not widened, not narrowed, but sharpened. The way a lens sharpens when it finally finds its focus. I thought about how he had said nothing after that moment, had simply stepped back and allowed the briefing to proceed as scheduled, his voice as measured as ever while he addressed Director Kwan and the others around the table. As if nothing had happened. As if he had not just watched my hand betray 11 months of careful silence in a single unguarded second. I pressed both palms against my face in the dark and tried to breathe. 14 weeks. That was how far along I was. Far enough that the nausea had finally quieted, not far enough that anyone looking at me in a winter coat would notice. I had spent those 14 weeks constructing a version of my life that could hold this truth without collapsing. A smaller apartment lease I was already renegotiating, a conversation with my sister in Atlanta that I had been postponing. A plan that existed mostly in fragments, in notes I kept in a locked journal, in the quiet arithmetic of savings and logistics that I ran through my mind during meetings. What I had not constructed was an answer to the question Jimincio's eyes had asked me in that pale gray room. Because the answer was not simple. The answer was the kind of thing that changed the shape of everything around it. I got up at 5:30, made tea I didn't drink, and sat by the window watching the streetlights thin as the sky turned gray. By the time I reached the 42nd floor, I had decided on a strategy. Behave as though yesterday morning had been unremarkable. People read what you gave them. If I gave Jimin nothing, no hesitation, no avoidance, no excess, then there was nothing for those calculating eyes to work with. The strategy lasted until 10:47, when Director Kwan appeared at my desk. "Mr. Essio would like you to accompany him to the Meridian meeting this afternoon," he said, without preamble. "Wheels up at 2. I looked up. "The Meridian meeting is in Seoul." "Yes. That's..." "Director Kwan, I wasn't briefed on international travel this week. My schedule has been adjusted." He placed a thin folder on my desk. "Travel documents, itinerary. 2 nights at the Park Hyatt. Return flight Thursday morning." He walked away before I could form another sentence. I sat very still for a moment, staring at the folder. In 11 months, I had accompanied Jimincio to 4 international meetings. Each had been scheduled at minimum 2 weeks in advance, coordinated with the travel team, built around preparation I spent days completing. This was 48 hours' notice in a folder handed to me without explanation. He had never done this before. He was doing this now, the morning after he watched my hand move to my stomach. The connection was not subtle. It was, in fact, so direct that it scared me more than subtlety would have. I opened the folder and began reading. The flight was aboard a private aircraft, standard for his longer international travel, departing from a private terminal at O'Hare. The Meridian Group was a legitimate development firm based in Seoul, with whom the SEO Group had maintained a formal partnership for 3 years. The meeting agenda covered 3 items: quarterly performance review, a proposed expansion into 2 new districts, and a contract renewal discussion. All of it was real. All of it required my preparation. And yet, I spent the 4 hours before departure completing every document that meeting could possibly require, and I did it with my hands steady and my jaw set, because whatever was happening, whatever Jim and Seo was calculating behind those dark, unhurried eyes, I would not arrive unprepared. The drive to the terminal was in his car, a black armored vehicle with tinted windows that I had ridden in exactly twice before. His security lead, a broad-shouldered man named Tae, who communicated mostly through presence and the occasional single-syllable confirmation, sat in the front beside the driver. Jimin sat in the back beside me, separated by a distance of perhaps 18 inches, his attention directed at a document on his phone. We did not speak during the 20-minute drive. But I was acutely aware of him, in the way you're aware of something that generates its own atmosphere. The faint cedar of his coat, the absolute stillness of his hands, the fact that he had not glanced at me once since I entered the vehicle, and that his not glancing felt, paradoxically, like the most attentive thing in the room. On the aircraft, I took my usual seat across the aisle from his, the unspoken arrangement we had maintained across every shared flight. I opened my laptop. He made 2 calls, both in Korean, both brief. The first was operational. The second, I caught only fragments before I redirected my attention deliberately. Seemed personal in a way his calls rarely were. A name I didn't recognize. A question about something being confirmed. A pause in which he listened longer than he spoke. He ended the call, and for the first time since the previous morning, looked directly at me. "You prepared the Meridian documents," he said. Not a question. All 3 agenda items, plus contingency briefs for the contract renewal subclauses. They're in the shared folder. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite approval. Something quieter than that, and more considered. "When did you eat last?" he asked. The question was so like the one he had asked 7 months ago in that empty office that for a moment I simply stared at him. "I'm fine," I said. "That wasn't what I asked." He held my gaze for exactly the length of time it took me to understand that he was not going to look away first. Then he reached across the aisle and placed a small paper bag on the edge of my tray table. "From the terminal," he said, and returned to his document. I looked at the bag. Inside was fruit, a sandwich, a bottle of water, and something wrapped in paper that turned out to be a small container of warm soup. I ate every bit of it, with my eyes on my screen and my throat tight for reasons I could not fully articulate. Seoul received us at 6 p.m. local time. The city lit in a way that always struck me as both exhausting and magnificent. Towers of light pressing against a charcoal sky, the Han River glinting below as the car moved through streets that Jimin's team had already mapped and cleared. There was always this quality to his travel, the invisible machinery that moved before him, checking, clearing, arranging, so that by the time he arrived anywhere, the environment had already been shaped around his presence. I had always admired the efficiency of it. Now, in the quiet back seat with the city sliding past the window, it felt more like something else. Like the air that surrounded him was simply a larger version of the gravity I had noticed on my 3rd day of work, expanding outward, rearranging whatever it touched. The hotel suite was 2 rooms, his and, adjacent to it with a connecting door left unlocked per travel protocol, mine. My room was larger than my Chicago apartment by a significant margin, and I stood in the middle of it for a long moment, absorbing the absurdity. A knock at the connecting door. "Arya?" I crossed to it and opened it. He was standing on his side of the threshold, jacket removed, and I noticed, as I always carefully chose not to notice, the way the tattoos continued down from his neck onto his forearms where his sleeves were rolled back. Maps of somewhere I was not supposed to wonder about, The Meridian dinner is at 8, he said. But before that. He paused, and in that pause was everything he was deciding whether to say. I need you to tell me something. My stomach dropped so cleanly it felt like stepping off a curb I hadn't seen. Of course, I said, and my voice was almost steady. His eyes moved to my hand, my right hand, hanging at my side, the one that had betrayed me yesterday morning with a single instinctive motion. Yesterday, he said, in my office. The room was very quiet. Outside, Soul murmured its 12 million voices against the glass. You were unwell, he said. It was not a question or an accusation. It was a man placing a piece onto a board he had been studying since the morning prior, with the particular patience of someone who did not need to rush, because he already knew he would arrive at the answer. I'm recovered, I said. That's not what I mean. The silence stretched, and I made, in that hotel room in Seoul, with the city glowing behind me and the connecting door open between us, what was perhaps the most consequential small decision of my life. I said nothing, but I did not look away. And in the language that had developed between us over 11 months of proximity and professionalism and carefully maintained distance, saying nothing while holding his gaze meant something very specific. It meant, you are not wrong. I watched it register in his face. Not shock, not anger. Something far more dangerous than either. Recognition. The Meridian dinner passed like a scene observed through glass. I sat 2 seats from Jimin at a long lacquered table inside a private dining room on the 31st floor of a building that didn't appear on any public directory, surrounded by men who smiled with their mouths and calculated with everything else. I translated when needed, presented 3 summary points from the contract brief when Director Yoon of Meridian asked for clarification, and kept my posture straight and my expression professional for 2 hours and 40 minutes, while my mind lived entirely somewhere else. Jimin, for his part, was extraordinary to watch in these settings. And I use that word with the clinical precision it deserves, not admiration. He was extraordinary the way certain natural forces are extraordinary. Not because they perform, but because they simply are, and everything around them reorganizes accordingly. He spoke less than anyone at the table. He agreed to nothing outright. And yet by the time dessert was cleared, the Meridian representatives were nodding at terms that, 40 minutes earlier, they had been quietly resistant to. I had watched him do this before. Tonight it felt different, because I knew that the same mind running those quiet calculations across a dinner table had spent the previous 20 hours running a different set entirely. And I was the subject of them. He said nothing to me in the car back to the hotel. Tai sat in front. The city moved past. Jimin looked out the window with his hand resting on his knee, and I watched the reflection of passing lights trace across the glass near his face, and told myself to think about logistics, about the morning meeting, about anything that was not the expression I had seen in his eyes when he said the word recognition, without actually saying it at all. At the hotel, we rode the elevator to our floor in silence. At the corridor that led to our rooms, he stopped. Sleep, he said, without turning to look at me. The Meridian briefing starts at 9. I need you at full capacity. Of course. He started toward his room, and I had taken perhaps 4 steps toward mine when his voice came again, quieter this time, carrying down the empty hallway with a precision that felt deliberate. Arya. I stopped. You should have told me you were unwell. Before the 9 days. A pause, measured and exact. I would have made arrangements. I stood very still with my back to him, and the carpet soft and silent beneath my feet. I know, I said. A long moment. Then the sound of his door closing, and I was alone in the corridor with the hum of the ventilation system and the specific weight of words that meant far more than their surface. I woke at 3 a.m. to a sound I couldn't immediately place. Low voices somewhere near the connecting door, the rustle of movement. I sat up in the dark and listened, and the sounds resolved into what I recognized as Ty's voice, and then one other, speaking in rapid, clipped Korean that I caught only in fragments. Confirmed. The source is reliable. Kwan is handling the secondary check. Then Jimin's voice, very quiet, asking a single question I didn't catch. Then silence. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling. This was the other side of his world, the one that existed beneath the lacquered dinner tables, and the precise contracts, and the 42nd floor with its muted charcoal walls. I had known it was there from the beginning. You didn't work for Jimin SEO for 11 months without understanding that the SEO group's address in a glass tower was only one of several truths, stacked on top of each other like transparencies, each one altering what you saw when you looked through the hole. I had never asked questions about the other layers. It was not my function, and more than that, it was not safe. Not because he had ever threatened me, but because I had watched what happened to people who reached for things they hadn't been offered. The reaching itself became the problem. I pressed my hand to my stomach in the dark. 14 weeks. The calculation I had been doing since the moment 2 parallel lines appeared on a pharmacy test in my bathroom in Chicago now took on a different geometry entirely. Because the question was no longer simply how, but when, and Sol had moved that timeline forward by a distance I hadn't accounted for. He already suspected. By morning, suspicion would sharpen into something harder. I needed to decide, before that happened, what I was going to say. The Meridian briefing ran from 9 until 11:40. I was present and functional, and contributed 3 precise interventions that moved the contract language in directions favorable to the SEO group's position. Afterward, Director Yoon shook my hand with the particular warmth men in his position reserved for people they had underestimated and were recalibrating. Jimin watched that handshake from across the room. He watched it the way he watched most things, without visible reaction, with that quality of stillness that was somehow louder than movement. But there was something in the angle of his attention that I had not seen directed at professional interactions before, something with an edge to it. When Director Yoon finally excused himself, Jimin crossed the room. Not quickly. He never did anything quickly. But with that particular directness that meant the conversation had already been decided before he arrived at it. "The afternoon is clear," he said. "Tae will take you to the Bukchon district if you want to walk, or you can work from the hotel." I blinked. That's not necessary. I have the return document preparation. Soo-yeon can begin it from Chicago. She has the templates. He was giving me free time in Seoul. Jimin Seo, who scheduled every hour with the precision of someone who understood that time, once lost, did not negotiate its return, was offering me an unstructured afternoon. "Why?" I asked, and the word came out more directly than I intended. He looked at me for a long moment. "You need air," he said simply. "And I need to make 2 calls that will take most of the afternoon." It was practical. It was also, and I was learning that these things were rarely mutually exclusive with him, something else. I walked Bukchon with Tae 3 paces behind me, which should have felt strange and somehow did not, because I had stopped cataloging strange as strange some months ago. The neighborhood was steep lanes between old tiled rooftops, the air carrying the smell of pine and stone and something sweet from a small bakery wedged between 2 walls. I bought tea from a street vendor and stood at an overlook with the city spreading below, and thought about my mother, who had died when I was 19, and who had believed absolutely that the path of least resistance was not the same as the path of least consequence. She had been right about most things. When I returned to the hotel at 4, there was a message from Jimin waiting on the room's notepad, handwritten, 3 words in Korean, "Rest before dinner." I sat on the edge of the bed and held the notepad and felt something shift quietly inside me. Not softening. I would not call it that. More like a wall recognizing the pressure against it. He came to the connecting door at 6:30. "There's no dinner tonight," he said. "I had it moved to tomorrow's agenda." He looked at me with that careful, unhurried attention. "Sit down, Arya." Something in his voice made argument irrelevant. I sat in the chair near the window. He remained standing, not looming, not threatening, just present in the way that was particular to him. "I had someone run a review of your leave request," he said. My blood went very cold. "Routine HR cross-check," he continued quietly, watching my face. The reason listed was vague enough to require clarification for the insurance documentation. A pause. "The clinic file was forwarded to HR, Dr. Kim's office, 14 weeks. The number in his voice in that room landed like something physical. I did not speak. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," he said. His tone had not changed. Still even, still measured, still carrying that quality of control that never required volume to be felt. "I am telling you what I know, so that you understand there are no more gaps in my information." "That file was private," I said, and my voice came out remarkably steady, given that every nerve in my body had gone rigid. "Yes." He did not apologize. It was. I looked at him, really looked at him. Past the composure and the precision and the careful architecture of authority he wore, as naturally as the black suit. "What do you want from me?" I asked. It was the first time in 11 months I had asked him a direct question that had nothing to do with work. He was quiet for long enough that the city outside filled the silence. Soul in the early evening, layered and relentless. "The father," he said finally. "I want to know who he is." And there it was. The question behind all the other questions. The one that had been sitting in the room since yesterday morning in Chicago. I had known it was coming. I had rehearsed 100 different answers. Clinical ones. Evasive ones. Answers that redirected and answers that deflected. But sitting in that chair, in that room, with him looking at me with eyes that had stopped calculating and started simply waiting, I found that every rehearsed answer dissolved. Because the truth was this: there was no one else to name. There had been one evening, 8 weeks before my leave request, when the office had been empty and a contract deadline had pushed us both past midnight. When the distance of 18 inches had, through no singular dramatic moment, but through the accumulated weight of 11 months of proximity, simply ceased to exist. When I had made a choice that I had spent the week since trying to file neatly into the same drawers I filed everything else, the drawers had not held. I looked at Jim and Co. across a hotel room in Seoul, with 14 weeks of truth pressing against every careful wall I had constructed, and I said the only thing that was left to say. "You already know," I said quietly. "That's why we're in Seoul. That's why the file. That's why all of it." The silence that followed was unlike any that had come before it. He crossed the room. Not quickly. He never did anything quickly. He stopped in front of my chair and looked down at me, and his expression had broken open in some way that I had no previous data for. No catalog entry, no prior observation to reference. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "I know." We flew back to Chicago the next morning. The return flight carried a different silence than the one that had brought us to Seoul. Heavier, more inhabited, the kind of quiet that forms after something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Jimin sat across the aisle with a document open on his lap that I was fairly certain he had not read a single word of. I kept my eyes on my laptop screen and processed nothing on it for 4 consecutive hours. What had followed his quiet confirmation in that Seoul hotel room had been, in practical terms, very little. He had not demanded explanations. He had not raised his voice. But then, he never did. He had simply stood there for a long moment, looking at me with that broken open expression that I had no framework for. And then he had said, in a tone so measured it could have passed for calm, if not for the particular stillness of his hands, "We'll talk properly in Chicago." Then he had gone back through the connecting door and closed it. and I had sat in my chair by the window until Seoul went fully dark outside the glass, turning the words "we'll talk properly" over in my mind like an object I couldn't identify by touch alone. Now, at 30,000 feet, I watched him from the corner of my eye. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his thumb moved once across the edge of his phone screen without unlocking it. The way Tae had positioned himself at the front of the cabin with the precise awareness of a man who understood that his employer needed a particular kind of space right now and was providing it without being asked. Everyone in Jimin's world moved like that, in response to signals too small for ordinary observation. I had spent 11 months learning to read those signals. I was only now understanding that he had spent 11 months reading mine. Chicago received us with gray skies and a wind off the lake that cut straight through everything. The drive from the private terminal moved through streets slick with recent rain, and I watched the city rebuild itself outside the window. The familiar architecture, the familiar light, the particular exhaustion of a place that never fully slept. I expected to be dropped at my apartment building. Instead, the car continued past it. "Where are we going?" I asked. "My residence." He said it without looking up from his phone. "There are things to discuss that require privacy. I have my own apartment, which has standard building security and a doorman who goes off shift at midnight." He looked up then, and there was something in his expression that had moved past patience into something quieter and more absolute. "Arya. Just my name. One word, but it carried the entire architecture of what he was telling me. That the world he moved through operated by different rules than the one I had been managing on my own, and that whatever had changed between us in Seoul had changed those rules further still. I looked out the window and said nothing. His residence was not what I had imagined, in the vague way I had occasionally imagined it. Not a penthouse full of deliberate cold beauty. It was a townhouse in Lincoln Park, set back from the street behind a gate that opened at a signal from the driver. 4 stories of dark brick and iron, lit from within by warm light. 2 men stood at the entrance whose stillness told me everything I needed to know about their function. Inside, the space was large and carefully ordered, but it held something I hadn't expected. Books. Actual books, on actual shelves, lining an entire wall of what appeared to be a study just off the entrance hall. Not display books, read ones with marked pages and worn spines. A ceramic mug still sitting on the side table. A hand-drawn city map pinned above the desk with notations I couldn't read from the doorway. Someone lived here. Actually lived here. A woman appeared from the back of the house, small, perhaps 60, with the manner of someone who had worked in close proximity to Jim and Seo long enough to have developed her own version of his quiet efficiency. She bowed slightly and spoke to him in Korean, asking whether he wanted tea. He answered yes. Then he turned to me. "This is Mrs. Han. She manages the house. If you need anything—" "I don't need anything," I said. "I need you to tell me what exactly is happening." He looked at me steadily. "Come sit down." The study held 2 chairs and a low table between them. He waited for me to choose a seat before taking the other one. A small thing, barely a gesture, but I noticed it the way I noticed all his small things. Mrs. Han appeared briefly with tea and disappeared again with the noiselessness of long practice. Jimin sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at me with an expression I was still struggling to categorize. The composure was intact. It was always intact. But beneath it was something that had been disturbed, like water after a stone, still moving in slow rings outward. "I want to understand the timeline," he said. "The timeline," I repeated. "When you realized, what you decided, why you planned to say nothing." The directness of it was somehow easier than I had expected, perhaps because indirection had been exhausting me for weeks. The weight of managing a secret in close proximity to the one person it most directly concerned. "I realized at 6 weeks," I said. I decided to manage it independently because I stopped. Started again. Because the alternative required a conversation I didn't know how to have, with someone I work for, in a situation that had no good version. You could have resigned, he said. Yes. But you didn't. I looked at my hands. No. A silence. Outside, rain had begun again against the windows, the particular soft percussion of Chicago in October. Why? He asked. It was a small question with an enormous interior. I turned it over carefully before I answered. Because this job is the best thing professionally that has ever happened to me. Because leaving felt like punishment for something that... I stopped again. Because I was not ready to disappear. He was quiet for a moment, that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. I want to be clear about something, he said finally, and his voice had shifted into a register I hadn't heard from him before. Lower, stripped of the professional layer, carrying something raw beneath its control. What happened that night was not something I have treated lightly. I looked up. I am aware, he continued, of the imbalance, of what it means that I employ you. I am aware that the circumstances created a situation that was not simple for you to navigate. His jaw tightened slightly. There were things I should have addressed before they accumulated to that point. I did not. That is something I have considered every day since. The rain moved against the glass. I sat very still. I don't need you to assign blame, I said carefully. I'm not assigning it. I'm acknowledging it. He held my gaze. There's a difference. There was. I knew there was. And the fact that he understood that distinction, and applied it without being prompted, did something to the careful architecture of distance I had been maintaining for weeks. What happens now? I asked. Practically, what are you proposing? He leaned back slightly. You'll move here. I blinked. I'm sorry. To this house. There's a full apartment on the 3rd floor. Separate entrance, completely independent. Mrs. Hahn can show you tomorrow. His tone was matter of fact, but his eyes were watching my reaction with that absolute attention. Your current apartment's lease is month to month. It can be ended without penalty. You checked my lease. I checked many things after Seoul. He said it without apology. Arya, you are carrying my child in an apartment building where the overnight security is a man who falls asleep before 2 a.m. I checked your lease. The bluntness of my child, spoken aloud, without qualification, struck something in the center of my chest. I haven't agreed to anything, I said. I know. He did not press. He simply waited, with that particular patience that was somehow more persuasive than pressure. And my position? At the firm? Unchanged. If you want it unchanged. A pause. Though I would ask that you stop pretending you don't need to eat during 12-hour days. Mrs. Hahn will have opinions about that. Something almost like a smile crossed his expression. Brief, careful, but real. It was so unexpected that I felt it rearrange something in my chest. This isn't simple, I said. No, he agreed. It isn't. The other parts of your life. I gestured vaguely, inadequately, at the space between us, meaning everything I couldn't say directly. The things that happen at 3 a.m. in hotel hallways. The people who check rooms before you enter them. He was quiet for a moment. Those parts of my life exist, he said. I won't pretend otherwise. But they are managed carefully, and they will be managed more carefully still. His eyes held mine with an earnestness that sat strangely and perfectly on a face I had catalogued for 11 months as unreadable. Nothing that belongs to that world will reach you, or the child. I will make certain of that. You can't promise. I don't make promises I can't keep. His voice was even, firm, and entirely without theatrical weight. It's one of the few rules I've never broken. The rain continued. The study held its warmth around us. I thought about my mother, about the path of least resistance versus the path of least consequence, about the journal in my bag with its careful arithmetic of a future I had been building alone, about the 14 weeks of a life beginning somewhere beneath my hands. "Show me the third floor," I said. He looked at me for one long, still moment. Then he stood. And for the first time since I had come to work for Jim and Sio, he held out his hand, not to direct, not to gesture, but simply offered. Open. Waiting. I stood, and I took it. His grip was steady and warm, and he released it after exactly 2 seconds. Enough to mean something. Careful enough not to mean more than I had agreed to yet. But as we moved toward the hallway, and I heard Mrs. Hahn already moving somewhere above us, and the rain said its steady thing against the dark windows of that Lincoln Park townhouse, I became aware of a truth that I had been holding at arm's length for 11 months, and could no longer maintain the distance from. I had not looked for a way out, because somewhere beneath every careful calculation and every neatly filed drawer, some part of me had already known there wasn't one. Not because of fear, because of something I was only just, finally, beginning to allow myself to name. 4 months passed in the Lincoln Park townhouse, the way seasons pass in places that hold you without gripping, gradually, with texture, leaving marks you only notice after the fact. The third-floor apartment was exactly as Jimin had described. Independent, complete, with its own entrance from the side street and windows that looked out over a small garden that Mrs. Hahn tended with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else. I moved my things from my old apartment on a Tuesday, in 2 trips, with Tay supervising the move in his particular way, standing near the door, arms folded, communicating through sheer presence that no one in the vicinity should consider doing anything inadvisable. I had thanked him. He had nodded once, which I had come to understand was Tay's equivalent of a warm speech. I kept my position at the firm. Jimin had restructured 2 of my responsibilities to reduce travel during the later months, reassigning the international coordination to Suyeon and a new hire named Park, who had the particular quality of being good at his work without needing recognition for it. He had told me about these changes in a brief meeting, presenting them as operational adjustments rather than accommodations, which I understood was his way of preserving something that mattered to me. The sense that I was still chosen for what I could do, not managed because of what I carried. It was a careful distinction. He was full of careful distinctions. We developed a new rhythm, the 4 of us. Jimin on the first 2 floors, myself on the 3rd, Mrs. Hahn moving through the whole house like a steady current, and Tay occupying whatever position the day required. Jimin did not intrude on my floor uninvited. He knocked, every time, without exception, and waited for my answer before the door opened. But he was present in ways that didn't require physical proximity. Tea appeared on my desk each morning, the specific kind, loose leaf, from a Korean grocery 3 neighborhoods over. On the evenings I worked late at the firm. A car arrived at the building entrance at 10 o'clock, regardless of whether I had mentioned staying late, which meant someone was watching the office lights in a way I had decided not to examine too directly. When I mentioned once, in passing, that the garden chair outside my entrance was uncomfortable for reading, it was replaced within 48 hours with something that cost more than my first car. I said nothing about the chair. He said nothing about replacing it. We were both fluent in this particular language by now. What was harder to navigate, harder than the practical architecture of our new arrangement, harder even than the physical changes of a body remaking itself around new life, was the emotional landscape that had begun shifting beneath my feet the moment I took his hand on the stairs. I had spent 11 months categorizing Jim and Sio as something external to my personal life, a force to be read and responded to, an environment to be navigated. The discipline required to maintain that categorization had been considerable, and I had congratulated myself on it regularly. Now, living in the same building, eating meals that Mrs. Hahn placed on the first-floor table with a pointed look at me until I came downstairs, sitting across from him in the evenings while he reviewed documents and I read or prepared the next day's briefs. Now, the categorization was simply no longer possible. He was, I discovered in increments, different in his own home than in any professional context I had observed. Not unguarded. I wasn't certain Jimin was capable of being fully unguarded, and I suspected that particular quality had been trained out of him long before I arrived in his life. But softer at the edges. He read in the evenings, real books with worn spines, and occasionally read passages aloud, not to me directly, but in the general direction of the room, as if thinking through something, and I had learned to respond, or not respond, according to whether the passage seemed to want a response. He cooked on Sunday mornings, badly and cheerfully, producing food that Mrs. Hahn politely relocated to the back of the refrigerator while presenting alternative options. He called his mother in Busan every Thursday at 8 in the evening and spoke to her in a register so different from his professional voice that the first time I overheard it, I stopped moving entirely, arrested by the sound of it. He was a person, a specific, particular, complicated person, and the more of him I saw, the more the carefully maintained architecture of professional distance became something I was building around air. The morning I went into early labor, 36 weeks, faster than the doctor had anticipated. It was 4:30, and I was alone on my floor, and the first thing I did, before I called the hospital, before I called my sister, was knock on the door at the top of the stairs that connected my floor to the main house. He answered within 20 seconds, already dressed, already alert. "It's time," I said. He looked at me for one moment, and in that moment, I saw something move across his face that he did not attempt to contain, something that had no professional category and required none. And then he was moving, his hand at my back, his voice low and steady, directing Tae, directing the driver, directing the shape of the next several hours, with that quiet authority that had once unnerved me, and now simply felt like ground beneath my feet. My daughter arrived at 7:41 in the morning, in a hospital room where Jimin sat in the chair beside the bed for 6 hours without complaint or comment, present in the particular way he was always present. Not loudly, not performatively, but absolutely. When the nurse placed her in my arms, I looked at her face and felt the world rearrange itself around a new center. She had his eyes. Dark, serious, already looking at everything with that quality of attention. I told him this later, when the room had quieted and she was sleeping in the bassinet between us. "She has your mouth," he said, without looking up from her face. We sat in that hospital room with our daughter between us and the morning light coming through the window, and I understood that whatever I had thought my life would look like, the careful plans in the locked journal, the neat arithmetic of a future built alone, had been replaced by something I hadn't known how to plan for because it required more courage than calculation. We named her Hana. She was 3 months old the evening Jimin appeared at my floor's door with a folder under his arm, and an expression I recognized as his version of careful preparation, the look he wore when a conversation mattered enough to have considered it in advance. I let him in and made tea and waited. "I want to tell you something," he said, sitting across from me at the small table near the window, with Hana asleep in the next room and the city doing its patient thing beyond the glass. "About how things were before you." I held my cup and listened. He talked for a long time, longer than I had ever heard him talk about anything that was not operational. About his father, who had built the SEO organization from nothing and ruled it with a coldness that Jimin had spent his adult life both inheriting and resisting. About the code he had constructed for himself in the absence of a better one. Loyalty, protection, precision, and the understanding that power without discipline was simply destruction with better clothes. About the isolation that came with the life, not loneliness exactly, but a narrowing, a gradual reduction of the world to its functional elements, until the only things that felt real were the things that required his management. And then, he said, looking at me directly, "You made a translation error in your second week, the Shanghai contact. You caught it yourself mid-sentence, corrected it without pausing, and kept moving. And I thought..." He stopped. Something crossed his face that was almost rueful. I thought, this person is not afraid of being imperfect. She just keeps moving. I stared at him. "You remember a translation correction from my second week. I remember everything about you," he said simply. Not as a declaration, as a statement of fact, plain and unembellished, which somehow made it land harder than eloquence would have. I set my cup down. "Jimin," I said. His name without the title felt significant even now. "What are you trying to tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, that I would like to stop managing the distance between us, if you are willing. The apartment held its small, warm silence. Hana made a sound in the next room, a brief, sleepy murmur, and then went quiet again. I thought about 11 months of careful cataloging, about Seoul and the connecting door, and a handwritten note saying rest before dinner, about a chair replaced without comment and tea from a specific grocery 3 neighborhoods over, and 6 hours in a hospital chair without complaint, about a man who checked rooms before entering them and still knocked on my door every single time. "I'm willing," I said. 6 months after that conversation, I stood in the garden behind the townhouse on a Saturday morning in May, watching Jimin carry Hana through the rows of plants Mrs. Han had spent the spring establishing. He was pointing at things: flowers, a small herb section, a bird that had landed on the iron fence, and narrating each one in the low, serious voice he used for everything, as though a 9-month-old required the same quality of attention as a contract negotiation. Hana regarded each item he indicated with her dark, considering eyes, patting his forearm occasionally with one small hand as though confirming the information. Mrs. Han appeared beside me with 2 cups of tea and made a sound that, in her vocabulary, constituted an entire paragraph of satisfaction. I took the cup and held it warm between my palms. I thought about the girl who had walked into that building 11 months ago, exhausted, invisible, holding herself carefully so as not to take up unnecessary room. I thought about how much of her survival had depended on the precise management of distance, on the filed drawers and the catalogued observations, and the professional armor worn so long it had started to feel like skin. I was not that girl anymore. The change had not been dramatic. It rarely is, for the things that matter. It had been a series of small, irrevocable choices. A hand pressed to a stomach in an unguarded moment. A silence held across a hotel room in Seoul. A knock answered at 4:30 in the morning. A name spoken without its title for the first time. Jimin looked up from across the garden and found me watching. He didn't wave, didn't call out. He simply held my gaze for a moment, the way he had always held it, with that unhurried, absolute attention that had once unnerved me and now felt like the steadiest thing I knew. Then he turned back to Hana and pointed at the bird, which had not moved. I drank my tea in the May morning light, with the city murmuring beyond the garden walls, and my daughter's voice beginning to rise in what I recognized as the preliminary stages of an opinion. And I understood, quietly, completely, without needing it to be said aloud, that I was no longer building a future alone. I was already living inside one.